Hi everyone, welcome to our third question and answer video on our channel. If you haven't seen the first two, I'll link to those videos in the description box below. I also want to thank FreePrints for sponsoring today's video. You'll see a FreePrints code specifically for my viewers that I will explain later. Kyle has a genetic disorder called SYNGAP1. We make these videos to show what our lives are like living with multiple disabilities and to help other families like ours feel less alone. How do you get past looking at the future? I'm worried about all of the things out of our control. This question immediately made me tear up because the future and all of the unknowns are the most difficult for me when it comes to Kyle. With Kelli, it's different, of course. Even though the specifics of her future are also unknown, I do know that hers will unfold in the typical fashion. She'll be able to live an independent life, provide for herself, and be able to make her own choices about everything in her life. With Kyle, he is 100% dependent upon someone else to make those choices. He can't live independently and will need 24-hour supervision. Kyle will be 17 years old next month, and it wasn't until about a year or so ago that I was able to begin talking about Kyle's future in detail. Before that, my husband and I would begin a conversation only for it to end in tears, and we'd give up, declaring that we couldn't think about it or talk about it. So to answer the question, thinking and talking about the future is a must for us, especially now that Kyle will officially be an adult in just over a year. I have found that what has provided me the most comfort is educating myself about Kyle's future. I'll explain what I mean with the next question. What is the plan for Kyle when we are no longer able to look after him? This is an example of one of the questions that I couldn't even begin to think about without bursting into tears and would just stuff away for something I would deal with later. But now it's later and I can't put it off any longer. I've spent the last year researching options for adults with disabilities, and although I'm still researching and still getting very emotional about it all, I have learned so much, and Jesse and I have begun discussions about a plan. We don't have a set plan yet, but we're getting close. I visited a local group home with 3 adults with special needs just to help me picture what a setting like that would look like for Kyle and if we would even want to consider it. I also traveled to another state to visit a skilled nursing facility that is specifically designed for adults with disabilities that require the level of care that Kyle will need. Although it was a difficult trip emotionally, it further helped to educate us in knowing our options. We also plan to visit other places over this next year. I also listen to a special needs podcast that educates parents on preparing for the future, and I recently attended a SYNGAP family conference where I heard 2 speakers who both have an adult child with Kyle's diagnosis who are living in group home settings and are thriving. All of these things are helping me to begin picturing Kyle's future and what would be best for him and for us. Although we don't know an exact timeline yet of when we will transfer Kyle's day-to-day care to other caregivers, we are trying to develop a plan now because there are several things to consider. Things such as finances, having our family know our plan in case something were to happen to us, long wait lists for Kyle to even be considered, and where Jesse and I are going to live. It's a must for us to live no further than about 20 minutes from him because even if his day-to-day care is handled by his staff, we want to be able to visit him and spend time with him daily or several times per week at a minimum. What does Kyle plan to do when he is an adult? Will he need to have continuous support and have someone to be with him who understands what SYNGAP1 is and how it affects Kyle? I touched on this with the last question, but yes, Kyle will need to have continuous support for the rest of his life. Because he cannot hold a job to support himself, is not potty trained, cannot feed himself completely, administer his own medication, and needs 24-hour supervision, he will require a skilled nursing staff that understands intellectual disabilities, which is part of his diagnosis of SYNGAP1. Our hope is that when Kyle is an adult and has aged out of his school, he will live a life that brings him joy. So for Kyle, that means his needs will be met, he'll be safe, he'll be surrounded by caregivers and other adults similar to him who know him well and will be able to participate in activities that bring him happiness. I know I had long answers for those first few questions, so let's take a quick break so I can tell you about FreePrints, the sponsor of today's video. Kelli and I both wanted to print some photos from our phones, and I heard about FreePrints, so we gave it a try. It's a free photo printing app where you can get up to 1,000 free photos per year delivered to your door just for the cost of shipping. But right now, with my code, you can get 15 photos and free shipping, so you can try without entering any payment information. Here are some of the pictures I received from FreePrints. Kaylee likes to add pictures to her photo wall, and after volleyball tournaments, she wants to print photos from her phone to add to the scrapbook she's creating. And I printed some pictures to make this photo cube for Kyle. Use my code to get your first order completely free today, and then you can go back whenever you want to order more and just pay a few dollars for shipping. I also put the code in the description box below this video. Now back to more of your questions. Will Kyle ever be potty trained? I can't say for certain whether he will ever be potty trained. I have tried, but with no success yet. I think it would be possible for him to be at least partially trained on a schedule, but the difficult part for me has been the time commitment it takes to get him trained. I tried for a solid month last year and spent so much time in the bathroom with him, and I just don't have that kind of time to make it consistent enough for him to learn. Because SYNGAP1 is rare and we don't have enough data, I am not aware of what percentage of individuals with SYNGAP1 are potty trained. I do know that there are individuals who have had success, but because SYNGAP is a spectrum disorder, it's my understanding that those who have been successful are not as severely affected as Kyle. I could be wrong though, so there is always still hope, but I would need significant help to accomplish it. I have a special needs son who is 9 and nonverbal. The school provided him with a communication device like Kyle's last year. Other than for requesting his favorite things, my son refuses to use his device and shows no interest in it. Did Kyle have a hard time learning to use his device? How did you encourage him to use it? Kyle began learning to use a speech device when he was about 5 years old, and it started with just using it for requesting favorites like your son. Under the direction of his school speech therapist, we even had to take it away for a time and go back to the PECS system because he wasn't using the device appropriately and we were not seeing progress. So don't be discouraged that your son has no interest yet, and just keep trying. It wasn't until Kyle began working with a private speech therapist at our children's hospital that he began actively using it more and more. He no longer has private speech, but his school teachers and school speech therapists regularly help him. Kyle responds well to praise, so he always used his device in a positive way that he found rewarding. His therapist also began with a setting that was very simplified and would only add words and choices as he progressed. So that's something to consider for your son. Maybe he is overwhelmed by it right now and simplifying it could help. Speaking of Kyle's speech, one of you asked, since Kyle can understand speech and use it on his talker, what is the main reason he doesn't produce it himself? Is it low muscle tone, or do you think he doesn't understand, or something else? I am not an expert on being able to explain this, but in simplest terms, Kyle's diagnosis of SYNGAP1 is a neurological disorder that affects certain pathways in the brain. Some individuals with SYNGAP1 are able to produce some words, but most I think are nonverbal. Speech requires breath control as well as being able to use the muscles controlling the tongue and lips to shape sounds into words. Since Kyle has low muscle tone, that is definitely a factor as well. What do you think Kyle would most like to be able to do that he either is not allowed to or is beyond his skill level? I like this question even though it made me imagine Kyle as a typical 16-year-old boy, not limited by intellectual disability. He likes to be on the move, and his favorite activity is to ride in the golf cart. So I think he would most like to be able to drive that himself whenever he wanted to and get his license to drive like his sister is doing now. Also, Kelli is active in volleyball, and Jesse played football and baseball growing up. So I imagine that Kyle would also like to be involved in sports if he could. What are Kyle's socialization skills like at school? Kyle loves school and likes the attention he gets from all of his teachers. He can tell when adults are responding to something he does and seems to like making his teachers smile and laugh because of his actions. Although he doesn't interact with his classmates in a typical manner, he does notice his peers, enjoys being around others, and observes them. We carpool with one of his classmates on occasion who is also nonverbal. It's interesting to watch Kyle look over at him at times, and you can just tell that he just enjoys having him in the car with us, which I think is sweet. Do you have Kyle perform any tasks at home like a simple chore he is capable of? This is the one thing I wish I would have worked harder on as Kyle grew up, but I don't beat myself up over it because life is hard and many times I was in survival mode just to get through the day. Some of Kyle's goals on his IEP this year include learning to do daily tasks that he can support a caregiver with, so I know I should carry this over into the home setting. In the school setting, he has worked on sorting laundry, folding towels, and sorting silverware. He also likes putting things away in bins, so cleaning up his toys is one chore he can easily help with. By what age did you have a pretty good idea of Kyle's developmental level? Was there a time when you expected or hoped he'd produce speech, for example? And what was it like coming to terms with the realization that he wouldn't be able to do certain things? Lots of great questions here. It's hard to pinpoint it, but at about age 5 or so, I felt I was beginning to have a grasp of what Kyle would be capable of doing and not doing. Of course, I knew he was capable of continuing to learn and progress, and he has, but it was at probably about that age that I started to realize that he would always need full support in life. As far as speech, I really thought that if we just worked hard enough, he would be able to learn how to form words. This was many years before we had a diagnosis for Kyle and before we had a clear understanding of his genetic condition. At about age 2, and after many speech therapy sessions, I shifted my focus from him being able to speak to other ways he could learn to communicate. Since we didn't have a diagnosis for Kyle until he was 14 years old, it was a gradual process in coming to terms with his limitations and disabilities. At times, I placed a lot of guilt on myself, thinking I wasn't doing enough, even though we were doing all the therapies and then some. There were times that the realization pushed me into research and finding the right school for him to help him continue to progress. It's hard to explain, but once I came to a sense of acceptance of Kyle's limitations and of what our lives were going to look like, it was easier to just be his mom and love him rather than always spinning my wheels and trying to do all the things. I really love seeing Kyle's enthusiasm about his Christmas presents this year. Has Kyle changed in other ways over the last 12 months or so? If you missed our last video with Kyle opening his Christmas gifts, I linked to it below. In the last 12 months, besides growing rapidly and reaching me in height, I think he has grown a little more patient. I'm talking in a general overview because he still has his moments where he bites at himself in frustration and cries, but he seems to tolerate some situations better, such as going in a store or a doctor appointment. He's also continued to make progress at school, learning more and more sight words and expanding his use of his speech device. What supports would you benefit from that you do not currently get? Either because they don't exist, are too costly, too far away, you don't qualify for them, even though you know it would be beneficial. Both Jesse and I agree that childcare would be something we would benefit from the most, but it's just too costly for us. Over Kyle's 17 years, I have worked full-time a total of 5 of those years, and it was difficult to manage when I did so. We couldn't afford childcare even while I worked, so thankfully we had my mom and mother-in-law to help. But as Kyle got older, we weren't able to continue relying on them for daily scheduled care while I worked. If we could afford childcare, I would be able to work full-time, which would really help us financially. Childcare is also needed for times that we travel for Kaylee's volleyball tournaments and for date nights and attending events that Kyle is not able to attend. Again, we rely on grandparents for this as well, since childcare is too expensive. How do you manage time for your daughter as well? Kyle requires so much of your time, I would think it would be so hard to have any more energy. It's been difficult at times to balance everything and have the energy, but I think it has gotten easier as they've gotten older. When Kaylee was younger, she and Jesse would schedule daddy-daughter dates, and we are also fortunate to have Kyle's grandparents nearby, so when they keep Kyle for an evening, the 3 of us will go to dinner together. That way the focus is on her and not feeding Kyle or trying to keep him happy. It also helps that Kyle attends a year-round school, so when Kaylee is off of school in the summer, we get quality time together while Kyle goes to school. What is Kyle and Kaylee's relationship like? They're only 13 months apart, but because of Kyle's intellectual disability, it feels like being a parent to a teenager and a toddler at the same time. It's been difficult as they have gotten older because Kyle doesn't interact with others in a typical fashion, and his behaviors can cause us to have negative feelings at times. Kaylee has taken Kyle for rides in the golf cart, but other than that, they don't have much to connect them and create a bond. By the way, I have been working on a project specifically for the siblings of individuals with disabilities based upon Kaylee's experiences, so as soon as it's complete, I'll announce more details about it. Speaking of Kaylee, she also received a question directed to her. Although she didn't want to share on video, I will read her response. Kaylee, what's the most difficult thing for you in having a disabled sibling and no other siblings? Do your friends understand, and has anyone ever been hurtful to you about Kyle? Kaylee says, I think the most difficult thing about having a disabled sibling and no other siblings is not having anyone to relate to. Yes, my parents I can relate to somehow, but I'm not Kyle's caregiver and my feelings differ from theirs. A difficult part is not being able to go out on a whim. We either have to find childcare or my parents have to deal with him and can be stressed. My friends are very understanding towards Kyle. No one has ever made fun of me for having a disabled brother, and I also have a friend who has a disabled brother as well, although he and Kyle are totally different, so it's still hard to relate to her about certain things. Sometimes, I can't read this part. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about what life would be like if he wasn't disabled. He would go to my school and drive me there in the mornings. He would probably play a sport and have his friends hanging around. We would probably still live in our old house. My mom would have her old job back, things along those lines. Thank you so much for all of your questions. Check out the description box below for the other 2 Q&A videos on our channel and for more information on how you can get 15 free prints and free shipping with our code. We'll see you next time.